Have you ever noticed how birds seem to know things before we do? As if they carry an ancient, ancestral wisdom that makes them avoid certain places, even when everything seems normal to us? I used to think this was just superstition, until I worked for too long in a cemetery in rural Illinois and saw firsthand what happens when nature recoils from something that should never have been buried. It was a common space, a grave like any other, a clean, discreet lawn marked by a simple, unmarked wooden cross. But as soon as you got closer, you could feel it. The silence there wasn't the same as the rest of the cemetery. It wasn't the respectful silence of the dead. It was a kind of emptiness that pressed against the chest, as if the air had grown denser in that particular area. That's when I noticed the birds, which used to fly over the field constantly, began to deviate. None landed on the grave. None flew over it. They traced curved paths as if skirting an invisible danger zone. First I thought it was a coincidence, but day after day, week after week, the same thing happened, and the strangest thing was that the other animals seemed to feel the same way. Even the neighbors' puppies were barking toward that part of the lot for no apparent reason. Cats that had been roaming the area disappeared for days, and slowly an uneasy feeling began to creep in among the gravediggers. It was as if something was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but wrong on an instinctive level. Primal, as if everything was too quiet, and this was a warning. But the warning wasn't enough, because at that time we didn't yet know what was inside that tomb, or what it really hid. And believe me, what made us suspicious didn't start with screams or apparitions. It started with something much worse. The smell. If you've ever felt that certain places carry a strange silence, a weight in the air that no one can explain, then you're not alone. This channel is made for those who see between the lines, for those who sense when something is off, even when everyone around them pretends everything is normal. Here, you'll hear stories that many would rather bury, but that continue to breathe in the darkness. If you're the type who doesn't look away when fear knocks at the door, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. And if what I've told you so far has already given you goosebumps, leave a like so more people like you can find these stories. Because what's about to be told won't let you sleep peacefully. The town where it all happened is called Morrow Creek, a small place almost forgotten on the map, the kind where everyone knows each other by name, and where the cemetery is closer to the houses than one would comfortably admit. I've worked in this cemetery for over 18 years. I've buried over 300 people, seen families fall apart beside freshly dug graves, attended funerals in absolute silence, and also witnessed those filled with tears and lamentations. But no wake, no burial, and no body has ever caused me the kind of uneasiness that began on that cloudy September day when a funeral home truck arrived unannounced, carrying a sealed casket with the deceased's name replaced by a simple John Doe. In our routine, this wasn't exactly out of the ordinary. Unclaimed bodies or those without proper documentation received this classification. But even though it was normal, there was something about that day that was out of the ordinary. The sky was heavy but with no promise of rain. The wind blew as if whispering something we didn't want to hear. And the strangest thing was that none of us, experienced gravediggers accustomed to death, wanted to be there at that moment. There was a hesitation in the air. Movement was slower than usual. No one spoke loudly. Each footstep seemed to echo more than necessary. And when we lowered the coffin into the ground, everyone looked at each other with the same unspoken thought. Something is wrong here. Normally, anonymous burials don't cause any commotion. They're quick, silent, and bureaucratic. But this one seemed to weigh down the space like an invisible block of lead. The coffin was heavier than expected. I even needed help handling it. a rare occurrence for me, and even sealed, there was a subtle smell escaping from the edges, not the common smell of death, which over time we learned to recognize. It was different, denser, more persistent, like something that didn't belong to the world of the living, nor to the world of the dead. And it was from that very day on that everything began to change in the cemetery. But the first clear sign that this tomb was not like the others would come from where we least expected it, from the heavens. We usually look to the ground when we talk about the dead, but that day it was the sky that tried to warn us first. And what appeared up there wasn't a cloud nor a bird. It was an omen, and no one wanted to see it. It was a grey afternoon, the sky shrouded in dense clouds that seemed to hold the breath of time. The funeral home truck arrived 30 minutes late, and that was the first sign that this burial would be out of the ordinary. The driver didn't get out of the vehicle immediately. He stood there, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon for an unusually long time. Only after a brief phone call did he exit through the passenger side door, leaving the engine running. When he opened the back door, the casket was there, matte black with opaque metal handles and a simple label: John Doe, origin, Menard State Psychiatric Hospital. No detailed death certificate, no medical records, just the transport protocol. It was as if someone wanted to bury that body quickly, without too many questions. The absence of family members or legal representatives made the atmosphere even more uncomfortable. In practice, this meant we were the only ones there to bury someone who, in life, had seemingly been forgotten by everyone. Even so, there was a certain unease in the funeral director's own attitude. None of them wanted to get too close. One mentioned something about the body being in peculiar conditions, but remained silent when questioned. He hurriedly signed the papers and practically dropped the coffin onto the transport cart, as if wanting to get rid of the burden as quickly as possible. The movement to the gravesite was slow, not only because of the weight of the coffin, which was clearly heavier than normal, but because of a kind of psychological resistance that imposed itself upon us. Even the oldest ones, accustomed to dealing with the worst cases, hesitated. There was no prayer. There was no final speech. Just a heavy silence, broken by a few footsteps and nervous coughs. I remember well the sensation of pushing the earth over that coffin and feeling as if it refused to cover what was inside. Each shovel seemed harder than the last. The soil, though dry, seemed to weigh tons. When the hole was finally closed, something remained, a smell. It wasn't strong enough to cause alarm, but distinct enough to be disturbing. It had something acidic, metallic, as if the air had been contaminated. I remember taking 2 steps back and thinking, this is going to stay. And it did, for days, then for weeks. No matter how much rain it rained, that smell always returned, always spreading like an invisible shadow, slowly creeping among the graves. But the smell was just the beginning. The real sign that something wasn't right was yet to appear, coming straight from the sky, on the wings of creatures that always know what we pretend to ignore. You can bury a body, but you can't bury an omen. And when even the birds began to change their flight because of that grave, we understood something down there was still alive in a way no one wanted to believe. The first to notice were the residents of the cemetery's side street. It was common to see flocks of starlings, crows and pigeons flying over the area in the early morning hours, circling among the ancient trees and time-worn tombstones. It always gave me a strange feeling of life coexisting with death. But a few days after the nameless man's burial, this routine changed subtly but definitively. The birds began flying in wide arcs, avoiding the western side of the plot, where the grave had recently been filled. And the most disturbing thing was that this change wasn't random. It was deliberate. They flew normally over all the other areas, perching on stone crosses, pecking at the ground for insects. But when they approached that particular sector, they changed course, as if an invisible field repelled them. At first, I tried to rationalize. Maybe there was some kind of insecticide in that area, or maybe the soil had been treated with a chemical that caused the animal's olfactory rejection. But no application had been made. No different product had been used on that lot. And yet, day after day, the flights remained strangely diverted, as if there was something in that space that the animals instinctively recognized and feared. Things got worse when the neighborhood dogs began barking frantically every time someone passed by the west wall. Dogs that had previously roamed freely began to retreat with their tails between their legs, staring intently at the gravesite. One even refused to leave the yard, hiding under the porch, trembling for hours. Cats that used to jump the wall and roam among the graves disappeared. For days, no one saw a single feline among the graves. It was as if the entire cemetery was being avoided, not out of fear of death, but because of something even death couldn't accept. And then, one Sunday morning, I witnessed something that made my stomach churn. A crow, one of the few still approaching the area, landed briefly on the branch of a dry tree near the grave. In less than 5 seconds, it let out a shrill cry, flapped its wings violently and fell dead. No sign of injury, no visible explanation, it just fell. That was enough to drive everyone else away. Since then, not a single song had been heard in that part of the cemetery. And it was in this sepulchral silence that other signs began to reveal themselves, but not from the sky, but from the earth. When even the animals retreat, it's because something very ancient has awakened. And if the sky has stopped singing, it's because the earth has begun to whisper. And what it revealed next, no one was prepared to see. The first physical signs began to appear discreetly, like small cracks in a system that had seemed to work perfectly until then. On the 3rd day after the burial, the flowers that had been routinely planted around the grave, yellow chrysanthemums, were completely wilted. This wasn't just the natural fading of time. They were dark, soggy inside, as if they had leached something toxic from the soil. At first, I thought it was a watering problem. But when I touched the soil, I realized it was dry, crackling under my fingers. The moisture simply wouldn't stay there, as if it had been expelled. Over the next few weeks, the grass that had once grown evenly around the grave began to yellow. First in small circles, then in ever-widening strips, until a nearly perfect pattern of dead earth formed around the headstone. No gardener could keep the space alive. New seeds would not germinate there. It was as if the soil itself had been cursed by something lying beneath it, refusing any attempt at regeneration. But what really started to scare us was the smell. It wasn't constant, nor strong enough to warrant a formal complaint. But it would arise at random moments, like a rotten whisper escaping from the ground. It was a stench that mixed rust, spoiled meat, and sulfur. Sometimes it spread throughout the entire ward. Other times, it seemed to concentrate exclusively on the edge of the pit. No matter how many times we dug nearby trenches or treated the soil, the odor returned, always in the same place. Even the oldest employees began to comment. One of them, who had buried victims of fires, drownings, mutilations, and even a decomposition forgotten for weeks, confessed to me that he had never smelled a smell that provoked nausea as quickly as this one. And the strangest thing, it didn't seem to come from a decomposing body. It was more chemical, more ancient, as if something beneath the surface was rotting over time, from the inside out. Even so, there was no way to justify exhumation without a court order, so we were left to live with that increasingly hostile environment. But the cemetery isn't just made up of graves. It's also made up of those who work there, and it was when the first gravediggers began to fall ill and flee that part of the land that we realized it wasn't just the soil that was being contaminated. Something was starting to affect people. Working in a cemetery is, in itself, a constant exercise in coexisting with silence. But there are silences that welcome, and there are silences that suffocate. And what settled over the west side of the grounds, where that grave had been dug, was the kind that seemed to grow with the passing days. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a deliberate suppression, as if ordinary noises, wind in the leaves, the whistling of distant birds, the creaking of gates, were swallowed by an invisible presence. Even footsteps echoed differently on that ground. They had a hollow, unresponsive sound, as if the environment itself refused to return the noise. Over time, the physical discomfort became undeniable. I began to notice that every time I approached the grave, a slight headache would settle in the back of my neck. It wasn't exactly a sharp pain, but a heaviness, as if something were pressing down on me from within. Other gravediggers began reporting similar symptoms: sudden nausea, dizziness, intense sweating. One even fainted near the grate, claiming the air there seemed denser, making it difficult to breathe. And whenever anyone had to perform any task near the grave, weeding, arranging headstones, carrying tools, they did their best to finish quickly and get out of there as quickly as possible. One day, I had to spend more than 20 minutes in the West Wing, rearranging some signs that had been blown over by the wind. When I returned to the office, I went straight to the bathroom to vomit. I hadn't eaten anything bad. I wasn't sick, but something was affecting me only in that area. In that damned perimeter of ground where the grass died, the smell returned, and the animals disappeared. It began to haunt me in a way I couldn't explain even to myself. Things got worse when one of the cleaning staff, who refused to work near the grave, began having recurring nightmares about the black coffin. She didn't know the details. She never got close. But she dreamed the coffin would open, and something inside would call out to her softly, like a desperate whisper from beneath the earth. From that day on, she requested a shift transfer, and she never returned. But every story has that moment when someone decides to defy fear. In our case, it was a new employee, and what happened to him in that place still makes me doubt reality to this day. Some avoid fear, others face it head-on. But when he stepped onto that ground, silence didn't just surround him, it responded. And what happened there, none of us has ever forgotten. His name was Dean Harper, young, newly hired, the kind who arrives thinking old cemetery stories are just the exaggerations of jaded veterans. Less than 2 weeks into his job, Dean was already mocking the West Wing, laughing at the delusions about the cursed tomb and dismissing it as pure nonsense fueled by impressionable minds. We, who had already learned to respect the inexplicable, preferred not to confront him. We let time and the earth itself teach us what our words could not. One Friday morning, Dean decided to make his rounds alone, carrying only a shovel, a broom, and the radio strapped to his waist. His goal was simple: to prove it was all superstition. He walked straight through the iron gate and headed toward the West Wing with a smile on his face and an arrogance that deeply bothered me. For 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. He swept up dry leaves, organized tools, even whistled to provoke those watching from afar. But then he stopped. He stood motionless, staring at the unmarked grave. From where I stood, I saw the exact moment his body stiffened. He dropped the shovel. Then he put his hands to his head. He staggered back 2 steps, as if he'd been hit by an invisible blow. The radio on his belt began to emit static, something it had never done before. communication cut out, and all we could hear was a muffled sound, like ragged breathing and a murmur no one could identify. When we finally ran over, Dean was lying on his side, his eyes open, staring at the sky. He wasn't dead, but he seemed completely lost. We took him to the City Hall outpatient clinic. He couldn't speak. For almost 2 hours, he remained mute, trembling and sweating. Only late in the afternoon, with the help of a doctor, did he finally whisper what he had felt. He said he heard knocks coming from underground, 3 knocks, precise, as if someone or something was trying to get his attention, trapped down there. At that moment, something inside me changed, because until then, everything we'd felt was subjective, sensations, premonitions, fears. But now there was a witness, someone who heard, and that's why I decided to investigate. I sought out the identity of the man buried there, and what I discovered about his past surpassed any nightmare I'd ever had in this place. When I decided to search for information about the man buried in the West Wing, I confess that a part of me expected to find nothing. Most bodies classified as John Doe are unrecognizable or abandoned by family members, and bureaucracy often erases almost all clues. But something told me this case would be different, and I was right. I started with the funeral home that had transported the body to Morrow Creek. The paperwork was incomplete, almost as if it had been filled out in a hurry. But one name appeared: Menard State Psychiatric Institution, a place that for most no longer existed, and for those who knew its history, it was better that it had remained forgotten. Menard's was closed after a series of allegations that never reached the media: mistreatment, unauthorized experiments, patients left to fend for themselves, the kind of thing that gets swept under the rug for political expediency. A former funeral home employee, now retired, agreed to speak with me in exchange for anonymity. When I mentioned the grave, the man paled. He said he remembered the body, that it wasn't just any John Doe. According to him, the patient was admitted at age 29 after a series of violent episodes in which he claimed to hear voices coming from the earth. He claimed something was calling to him, something that lived beneath everything, beyond the dead. The patient frequently mutilated himself, drew symbols with his own blood, and spoke languages no one could identify. Doctors tried conventional treatments, then experimental ones. Nothing worked. On the contrary, he seemed to grow stronger the longer he was isolated. Some internal. Reports mentioned disturbing incidents. A nurse who swore she saw him talking to something forming on the walls of his room. A guard who went insane after hearing the nocturnal murmurs coming from the patient's cell. In the end, they decided to sedate him permanently. He died under circumstances that were never clarified. The death certificate was delivered with the body, but it disappeared upon arrival at the cemetery. No relatives were located, no digital records existed. It was as if the man had been erased from the world, and yet the body reached us, as if it had been led by something that wanted to bury him there. Right there. I returned to the cemetery with the feeling that we hadn't buried a stranger. We'd buried a secret. And the more I read about his past, the more the pieces began to fit together, the symbols, the behaviors, the delusions. Everything pointed to something that wasn't just mental illness. It was invocation. It was cult. It was contact. What if this man wasn't just hearing voices? What if he was responding to something? It was then that we decided to watch the tomb, not with human eyes, but with cameras. And it was there, in the first nighttime recording, that the images revealed something that shouldn't be among us. The decision to install the camera wasn't easy. For the cemetery administration, it would be seen as a waste of equipment and pure superstition. But for us, who lived with the smell, the symptoms, the reports, and now the story of that, Buried patient, it was the only way to know what was really happening when no one was looking. Night security guard Rick Blaylock agreed to participate on one condition. The images would be seen by him and me, and no one else. He said he'd witnessed strange things on other nights in that area, but had never managed to record them. This was the chance to confirm or deny what everyone already sensed in the air. The camera was positioned in a tree opposite the grave, offering a wide view of the tomb, and an infrared nighttime recording system. It was an old piece of equipment, repurposed from the city hall, but still functional. We installed the system quietly during a muggy Monday morning. The cable was discreetly buried to the back quarters, where a small video recorder captured everything. We began discreetly collecting footage, reviewing the files every morning. For the first 2 days, everything seemed normal. Light wind, rustling leaves, absolute silence. But on the third night, at 3:12 in the morning, something different happened. The footage begins with a view of the grave, still surrounded by dry earth and dead vegetation. But around 3:12, a light mist begins to form, and it wasn't ordinary mist. It was like a whitish speck, slowly condensing, taking on a humanoid shape beside the grave. The figure was distorted, as if being shaped by heavy smoke. Rick paused the video right there. He stared at me silently for a few seconds before blurting out, "That's not a lens flaw." We continued watching. The figure seemed to crouch as if touching the grave. Then a high-pitched noise filled the recording, a sound reminiscent of a muffled scream mixed with static, something almost electronic yet organic at the same time. Then the image froze. The recording froze for 12 seconds. When it returned, the figure had disappeared. But something was different. The ground seemed slightly disturbed, as if it had been stirred from the inside out. We sat there for long, minutes without saying anything. The room seemed smaller, stuffy, and even the monitor emitted a strange buzzing sound we'd never noticed before. Rick said it wasn't the first time he'd seen something like it, but that he'd never recorded it so clearly. He suggested deleting the recording. I refused. We needed to keep it, if only to prove one day that we weren't going crazy. The next morning, Rick didn't show up. He didn't even call. I stopped by his apartment that afternoon. He was pale, his eyes sunken, the TV on mute, and the lights all on. He said he'd spent the whole night hearing the same sound from the video, that static scream coming from inside the walls. He also said he'd had a strange dream. In the dream, he was in the cemetery, but the cemetery was upside down. Trees sprouted from the sky, and the graves seemed suspended in mid-air, ropes pulling them down into the earth. And there in the center, the coffin of that nameless man was open and empty. He handed me the key to the monitoring room and resigned the next day. From then on, he never set foot in that section of the cemetery again. He never spoke of it again, and strangest of all, he began wearing a cross around his neck, even though he was a skeptical man and averse to any belief. I continued monitoring alone over the following nights. I reviewed the same footage countless times, frame by frame, trying to find flaws, patterns, anything that could explain what we saw. In one frame, for a split second, the figure seemed to look directly at the camera. The face was a featureless mass, but 2 dark spots appeared where the eyes should have been. That chilled me to the core. On the 5th night, a new manifestation occurred. At 3:18 a.m., this time, the camera captured what appeared to be a shadow shift, a sudden movement on the ground, as if the earth were breathing. A subtle but real jolt. And soon after, the vegetation around the grave withered, as if hit by an invisible wave. The plants, which were already few in number, shrank as if burned from the inside out. The following week, the recorder stopped working. It simply froze. No technician could repair it. I took the external hard drive to a computer store in a neighboring town. 3 files were corrupted, precisely those from the busiest nights. Only the first recording remained, but even that seemed unstable, with audio glitches and whitish specks like interference. It was as if something wanted to erase all evidence, as if a force opposed our attempt to record the inexplicable. The camera is still there, but it's no longer recording. Now it serves only as a static reminder of what we dared to do. A small blind eye stuck to a dead branch. No one from the administration is commenting on the matter. They say it was vandalism, but I know it wasn't. Because that same week, the caretaker reported finding small, deep, bare footprints around the grave. Fresh marks, as if someone had walked in a circle or waited for something. It was that very night that the storm began, and what happened under the freezing rain, with thunder streaking the sky and the ancient tree toppling over the grave, was merely the culmination of everything the camera had been trying to show us all along. It wasn't a warning, it was a harbinger. The camera merely confirmed what nature already knew, that whatever was buried there was never intended to rest. And now it seems to be just waiting for the right time to return. The storm began without warning. No rain was forecast for that Saturday night. The sky had been clear all day, with few clouds, a muggy heat typical of late summer in Illinois. But around 10 p.m., dark clouds began to form with absurd speed, as if pulled by something invisible directly over the cemetery. In less than 15 minutes, the wind picked up strength, and the air was permeated with electricity, the kind of energy that makes the hairs on your arms stand on end for no logical reason. That's when the first peals of thunder began to echo, long and heavy, seeming to come not just from the sky, but from deep within the earth. I was at home when the camera's motion alert went off. I grabbed my phone and with trembling hands began scrolling through the images. It was nearly impossible to see anything clearly. The rain pounded the lens, the trees swayed violently, and the image became increasingly shaky. But one thing was clear: something was moving around the grave. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was as if the ground itself was pulsing, as if something were about to emerge. The camera feed froze at exactly 10:47 p.m. The screen went black. The power in my house flickered, and for a few seconds, absolute silence fell, drowning out even the sound of the storm. It was as if all the noise in the world had been sucked into that grave. Soon after, the power returned and the rain intensified, but there, in that frozen moment, something changed. The next morning, the scene we encountered was one of pure amazement. A massive centuries-old tree had fallen right on the grave in question. The fall was so precise, it seemed to have been targeted. The impact was so strong that the ground cracked around it, opening narrow crevices that spread like inverted roots, and in the center of them, the coffin was visible, misaligned, crooked, partially exposed as if the earth were trying to spit it back out. It was raining lightly when we arrived at the site. Fog still covered part of the grounds, and the air was dense, heavy, and difficult to breathe. The city officer accompanying me kept his distance. The caretaker, who had returned to his shift after weeks away, stopped at least 10 meters away and refused to come any closer. Only me and the same doctor who, weeks earlier, had witnessed another disturbing scene involving that same tomb remained. No other graves were affected, no other trees had fallen, no other cracks in the ground. It was as if all the storm's energy had been concentrated there, in that single spot. The more skeptical tried to dismiss it as coincidence. The more sensitive refused to approach. And I didn't know what to think. The smell had worsened. The air around was unbreathable. Something there wanted to be noticed. Something there wanted to get out. The most disturbing thing was the animals' behavior. The birds were gone. Not a single song, not even the most resilient ones like the crows. The dogs on the side street had been howling incessantly since the early hours of the morning, and a cat, the only one still roaming the area, was found dead, sprawled in front of the rusty iron gate, its front paws pointing toward the cemetery. No one could explain it. They didn't even want to try. The area was cordoned off again. The city government demanded that the coffin be removed and inspected for strictly sanitary reasons. But everyone knew there was another reason behind the urgency. Public pressure. Whispers in bakeries, pharmacies, and park benches. People wanted to know what was buried there, and even if no one said it openly, everyone already had their own theory, and none of them were natural. The coffin was removed manually. No machinery was working near the grave. Tractors were failing. The funeral home's cement mixer broke down at noon and wouldn't start again. We had to use human force. When we pulled out the wooden structure, it was soaked, covered in dark slime, as if it had spent months. Exposed to the humidity of an abandoned basement, but the body had been buried recently. Nothing could explain its condition. As we approached the coffin, for health reasons, we were forced to open it. None of us wanted to be there. The doctor was sweating. The security guard was discreetly crossing himself, and I could no longer tell if the cold I felt was coming from outside or inside. The lid was cracked but still secure. The first nail gave way easily. The second snapped and broke, as if rotten inside. When we lifted the lid, the world seemed to stop, and what we saw inside proved that all that fear, all that silence, all that rejection of animals and nature itself was no exaggeration. It was just the truth waiting to be discovered. The body had changed, not just the familiar marks, chipped nails, internal scratches, black veins. But now there was something else. The face was different. It wasn't decay, it was expression. The expression, previously neutral and rigid, now looked satisfied. A subtle, almost imperceptible smile formed on the dry lips. The eyes, even closed, seemed ready to open, and the chest rose and fell, as if simulating breathing. The doctor placed his hand on it and froze. He didn't say a word, just took 2 steps back and looked at me as if I already knew the answer, and, in a way, I did. At the bottom of the coffin, next to the body, was something new, an object that hadn't been there during the previous inspection, some kind of ancient medallion, engraved with symbols that none of us could identify. Upon touching it, the security officer felt an electric shock and immediately released it, saying the object was too hot. But it was in the rain, inside a closed coffin. How? From that point on, the procedure was halted. Local authorities were called. The grave, for the 3rd time, was sealed, this time under state supervision, not with earth, but with sealed concrete and reinforced steel. And with the clear order, no one else was to approach. In the days that followed, the city returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. But there were suspicious looks, whispers on street corners, unasked questions. Because everyone knew that the storm wasn't just a climate change. It was a reaction, a warning, a last-ditch effort by the earth itself to return what should never have been buried. And since that night, something has changed in me too. Sleep doesn't come easily. Time seems to move differently, and every now and then, when the house is deeply silent and the dawn creeps on unhurriedly, I hear it. It's not the sound of rain, it's not the creaking of the roof. It's a muffled, rhythmic, distant sound, like knocks. 3 knocks, always 3. Then, silence. The same sequence Dean described before he disappeared. The same one I heard days before everything began to fall apart. The same one that now seems to follow whoever dared open that coffin. Because there are things that were never meant to be, unearthed. And there are silences that no longer accept being ignored. The decision to open the coffin wasn't taken lightly. There were no family members who could authorize it. But given the body's exposed state and the health risk posed by the crack in the ground, the city authorized a quick and controlled intervention. There were 3 of us, myself, a health inspector, and the same city doctor who had treated Dean weeks earlier. No one said much during the walk to the grave. The wind had died down, but the air was still heavy, almost pasty. The smell was now so acrid it brought tears to my eyes. The lid was secured with short nails and a dark wax seal, the likes of which we'd never seen used before in this type of burial. When the first seal broke, the sound was like wood being forced to yield after years of resistance. The second snap was sharper. When we lifted the lid, the darkness inside seemed to breathe. There wasn't enough light to see clearly, so we used a flashlight. And it was then that the truth, until then hidden beneath layers of doubt, was brutally revealed. The body was different. The skin, once pale and rigid, now had dark spots that spread like black veins, concentrated on the neck and fingers. But what really stopped us were the nails. They were broken, chipped down to the flesh. There was dirt beneath each one. The corpse's chest was turned sideways, as if he had writhed inside, and on the wooden lid there were marks, scratches. From the inside out, in a circular, repetitive pattern, as if the dead man had awakened at some point and tried to escape with what little strength he had left. The doctor, examining the body, turned as white as a sheet. He was shaking so hard, he dropped his flashlight twice. He said in an almost childish whisper that it wasn't possible. According to him, the injuries to his nails and hand muscles were consistent with recent physical exertion. "But he's been dead for weeks," he murmured, as if trying to convince himself. The security guard tried to maintain his composure, but he crossed his arms tightly, perhaps to hide the visible tremor in his hands. I, for my part, couldn't take my eyes off the inscription on the bottom of the coffin. Further ahead, in the bottom corner of the coffin, a nearly illegible word was scratched with a fingernail. "I'm back." The letters were shaky, interrupted by stains of dried blood. None of us could articulate a single plausible explanation. None of us wanted to believe what we were seeing, but the signs were there, clear, vivid, visceral. He had woken, or worse yet, he had never died. Perhaps what we buried wasn't exactly human. Perhaps the entity that possessed that body was still present, even now, even there, before our eyes. The doctor tried to take a picture with his cell phone. It shut off as soon as the camera was opened. We tried again with mine. The photo came out, but the file was corrupted. Just a dark, blurry band, as if the image had been consumed by some invisible interference. That was enough to tell us we shouldn't record anything. Whatever was there, it didn't want to be seen, only felt. The tomb was resealed under orders from above, with reinforcements never before used on any other tomb. Reinforced concrete was used, along with a metal frame around the coffin and vibration sensors installed around the tomb. Everything was done in absolute secrecy, with confidential documentation. The order was clear: seal, isolate and forget, as if burying the event were the only way to keep the city sane. And I took an indefinite leave of absence. I couldn't go back, not even to get my belongings. My colleagues avoided bringing it up. Some resigned in the following weeks. Others pretended nothing had happened, but I knew. I saw it. I smelled it. I heard the lid click. I stared at that body, those nails, that persistent scratch etched into the wood, the desperate record of something that wanted to return. And it did. The city on the outside returned to normal, but inside something changed. The countryside became colder, drier. The trees began to lose their leaves before autumn. The crows disappeared. The lawn in that section never recovered. Grass grew everywhere in the cemetery, except here. The soil rejected life as if still digesting what had been buried. And even now, with everything that's happened, with all the closed files and purchased silences, there's something I need to tell you. Because last night, just before I fell asleep, I heard 3 knocks, precise, rhythmic, exactly like the ones Dean described. A pause, 3 more, then silence. I jumped out of bed. I went to the front door. Nothing. The street was empty, but the air was thick, heavy, just like that day. And the smell, that same acidic, metallic smell, was coming from outside. Not from the sewage, not from the plants, but from the earth, right from the direction of the cemetery. I went back inside and locked all the doors. I sat through the night, knife in hand, TV on mute, trying to maintain my sanity. But nothing worked. Because now, every little crack, every vibration in the floorboards, every creak in the roof makes me believe it, is trying to find a way back. And what scares me isn't the sound, it's the silence between the sounds, the gap between the beats. The pause that seems to grow longer each night, as if something were waiting for the right time. And deep down, I know that time is coming. And it doesn't matter how much they try to hide or forget, because there are things the earth cannot contain, and there are dead who refuse to accept being buried. Since that day, I've never been the same. The images, the sounds, the memories, everything remains etched in me more powerfully than any real memory. I'm not talking about ordinary fear, the kind we feel when we see a figure or hear a crack in the dark. It's another kind of fear. It's the awareness that something exists beyond our comprehension. A silent presence that observes, that communicates through signs, that chooses places to dwell. And this tomb, lost in a forgotten cemetery, was one of those chosen spots. The west wing remains closed. No one buries there anymore. The space is fenced off and any attempt to approach is recorded by cameras. But the images now always show glitches, as if something distorted the signal, corrupted the files. Sometimes, not even the surveillance system dares to monitor what inhabits that soil. Gardeners refuse to work in that area. The birds haven't returned yet. Not even the winds blow through it anymore. It's as if nature has sealed a pact of oblivion, trying in vain to prevent anyone else from approaching. And even I, who speak from a more distant perspective today, can't help but wonder, what if this wasn't an isolated incident? What if what we buried there wasn't just an anomaly, but a warning? A chink in the veil that separates what we know from what's hidden. Perhaps there are other tombs like this, scattered across anonymous cemeteries, waiting for a specific event, a cycle, a right time to awaken. What if everything we've experienced so far was just the beginning? If you've made it this far, you know this story isn't like the others. And if, like me, you sense something amiss in this silence surrounding the dead, then you need to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each story told here carries traces of what's to come, and the next may reveal connections no one has ever dared to investigate, because if yesterday was the grave, tomorrow it could be the house next door. And when the birds stop singing around here, maybe you already know what that means.